The telegram arrived at Admiral Karl Dönitz's headquarters in Plön, northern Germany, just after 10 o'clock on the evening of May 1st, 1945. Dönitz, 53 years old, commander of Germany's submarine fleet, read the words twice before looking up at the officers gathered in the room. The message from Martin Bormann was brief. Hitler had appointed him, Dönitz, as the Führer's successor. Hitler himself, Bormann wrote, had died that afternoon in Berlin, fighting to his last breath against Bolshevism. Dönitz's hand holding the telegram did not shake. He had been a naval officer for 35 years, trained to receive orders and execute them without visible emotion. But the men watching him saw something shift in his face, a brief moment where the mask of professional composure cracked before reforming. The war he had fought for 5.5 years had just changed in ways none of them fully understood yet. "Gentlemen," Donitz said, his voice steady, "the Führer is dead." The room went silent. Not the silence of surprise, exactly. By early May 1945, everyone in that headquarters knew the war was lost. Soviet forces had taken Berlin. American and British armies controlled Western Germany. The Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years, had maybe a week left. But knowing Hitler was dead and hearing it confirmed were different things. One officer, a young commander whose name would not survive in the historical record, let out a breath that sounded almost like relief before catching himself. Dönitz did not notice. He was already thinking about what came next. The telegram made him head of state, but head of state of what? A country that barely existed anymore, armies that were surrendering in pieces, a government that had no capital because Berlin was a smoking ruin full of Soviet tanks. He looked at the message again, at Bormann's claim that Hitler had died fighting. Dönitz believed it. He would believe it for several more days, until the evidence became impossible to ignore. The truth that Hitler had shot himself in a bunker while Soviet soldiers fought their way through the streets above him, that he had taken poison first to make sure the bullet would work, that his last act had been to marry Eva Braun so she could die as his wife. None of that had reached Plön yet. What Dönitz did know, what every general in Germany knew by May 1st, was that continuing to fight was pointless. The question was how to stop, how to surrender in a way that saved as many German lives as possible, that got as many soldiers as possible into Western custody instead of Soviet, that preserved something, anything, from the wreckage. 200 miles south, in a command post near Munich, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring heard the news over the radio. The announcement came at 9:30 in the evening, May 1st, broadcast across what remained of German-controlled territory. Hitler, the radio said, had fallen at his command post in the Reich Chancellery, fighting to the last against Bolshevism. The new head of state was Grand Admiral Dönitz. Kesselring was 60 years old, one of Germany's most successful commanders, the man who had held Italy for 2 years against overwhelming Allied superiority. He listened to the announcement without expression, then turned to his chief of staff. "Get me a line to Dönitz," he said. The chief of staff hesitated. "The communications are unreliable, Herr Feldmarschall. It may take hours." "Then start now." When the call finally connected, 3 hours later, Kesselring's first question was practical. "What are your intentions regarding surrender?" Dönitz's answer was equally practical. "I intend to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, to continue resistance in the East long enough to evacuate as many troops and civilians as possible westward." It was a fantasy, and both men knew it. The Allies had agreed at Yalta that Germany would surrender unconditionally to all of them simultaneously. There would be no separate peace, no playing the Western democracies against the Soviets. But Dönitz would try anyway, because what else was there to do? Let 2 million German soldiers in Czechoslovakia and Austria surrender to the Soviets. Let the refugees streaming west fall into Stalin's hands. Kesselring understood. "I will maintain order here as long as possible," he said, "but my men are exhausted. Many units are already negotiating local surrenders." Do what you can, Donitz said. I will send word when I have terms. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Neither man mentioned Hitler except in the most perfunctory way. The Führer was dead. That changed the political situation, but not the military reality. They had armies to manage, surrenders to coordinate, millions of lives hanging on their decisions. There was no time for grief, even if they had felt any. In Flensburg, near the Danish border, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel received the news from Dönitz directly. Keitel was 62, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, one of Hitler's most loyal followers. For 12 years, he had taken Hitler's orders, defended Hitler's decisions, enabled Hitler's worst impulses. Other generals called him Keitel, a play on the German word for lackey. He had earned the contempt. He had sat through planning sessions where Hitler screamed at field commanders for hours. He had signed orders for the execution of hostages, for the murder of prisoners, for the destruction of German infrastructure in a final spasm of nihilistic rage. He had never said no. When Dönitz told him Hitler was dead, Keitel's face crumpled. He actually wept, tears running down his cheeks while Dönitz watched with barely concealed distaste. "The Führer," Keitel said, his voice breaking. "The Führer died a hero's death." Dönitz did not correct him about the hero's death part. Let Keitel have his illusions for now. "I need you to coordinate with the field commanders," Donitz said. "We are going to surrender, but we need to do it in stages. West first, then east. I want as many men as possible to reach western lines before we give up." Keitel pulled himself together, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Yes, Herr Gross Admiral, I will see to it." But Keitel's grief was real, and it would persist. At Nuremberg, a year later, sitting in the dock waiting to be sentenced to death, Keitel would still defend Hitler's military genius. "I believed in the Führer," he would tell the court, as if that explained everything, as if belief was a defense. Not all of Hitler's generals mourned. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the pioneer of German tank warfare, heard the news at his home in the Bavarian Alps, where he had been living since Hitler fired him in late March. Guderian was 56, a brilliant tactician who had argued with Hitler repeatedly over strategy, who had told the Führer to his face that the war was lost. Hitler had tolerated him longer than most because Guderian was too valuable to dismiss. But by March 1945, even Guderian's expertise could not save a situation that was beyond saving. When Guderian's wife told him what the radio had announced, he nodded slowly. "So it is finished," they said. "Are you relieved?" she asked. Guderian considered the question. "I am relieved the dying can stop," he said finally. "But I am not relieved about what comes next." What came next was occupation, partition, the complete destruction of the German military, trials for war crimes. Guderian knew all of that was coming. He had opposed Hitler's most insane orders, but he had also enabled the invasion of Poland, the conquest of France, the drive into the Soviet Union. He had commanded armies that left millions dead in their wake. Relief was not an emotion he had earned. In Czechoslovakia, Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner commanded Army Group Center, nearly 1 million men, the last major German force still intact and still fighting. Schörner was 52, a fanatical Nazi who hung soldiers for retreating without orders, who drove his men forward long after forward meant anything. Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal in the war's final days, a meaningless honor for a lost cause. When Schörner heard Hitler was dead, his reaction was fury, not grief. Fury. "They are lying," he told his staff. "This is enemy propaganda designed to break our will." His chief of staff, a major who had survived 4 years on the Eastern Front and knew delusion when he heard it, spoke carefully. "Herr Feldmarschall, the announcement came from Dönitz himself, from Flensburg. It is not propaganda." Schörner slammed his fist on the table. "Then Dönitz is a traitor. The Führer would never abandon us." But even Schörner could not maintain the fantasy for long. Within 2 days, he would receive direct orders from Dönitz to prepare for surrender. He would ignore them, continuing to fight for another week, until his own officers threatened mutiny. Then he would flee, abandoning his army, trying to escape to the Alps in civilian clothes. The Americans would capture him anyway. His million-man army would surrender to the Soviets, and most of those men would spend the next decade in prison camps in Siberia, if they survived at all. Schörner's fanaticism in those final days accomplished nothing except additional suffering. In Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl sat in a borrowed office at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, waiting to sign the instrument of surrender. It was May 7th, 1945, a week after Hitler's death. Jodl was 55, chief of the operations staff, the man who had translated Hitler's strategic visions into actual military orders. He had spent the week since Hitler's death trying to negotiate surrender terms that did not exist. The Allies wanted unconditional surrender immediately on all fronts. Dönitz wanted to surrender in the West while continuing to fight in the East. It was never going to work. Jodl looked exhausted. He had not slept more than 3 hours a night since May 1st. The surrender document in front of him was simple, barely 2 pages. All German forces would cease operations by 11:59 on May 8th. All troops would remain in place. All weapons would be surrendered. There were no special terms, no exceptions, no recognition of the fantasy that Germany could somehow negotiate from a position of strength. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, watched Jodl read the document. "Do you understand the terms?" Smith asked. "I understand them," Jodl said. His voice was flat, drained of emotion. "I would like to request additional time to communicate the surrender to our forces in the East. Many of them are out of radio contact. If we cannot reach them, they will continue fighting." Smith shook his head. "The deadline is firm. You have 41 hours from signing to cease all operations." Jodl nodded. He picked up the pen, hesitated for just a moment, then signed. When he finished, he looked up at the Allied officers surrounding him. "With this signature," he said, "the German people and the German armed forces are, for better or worse, delivered into the victor's hands." It was the only eloquent thing Jodl said that day. The rest was logistics, technical questions about communication procedures, about how to ensure scattered units received the surrender order. When it was done, Jodl was escorted out. He would be arrested 3 weeks later, tried at Nuremberg, convicted, and hanged. But in that moment in Reims, he was simply a defeated general signing away the existence of an army that had once conquered most of Europe. Back in Flensburg, Dönitz's government, such as it was, continued to function for another 16 days after the surrender. The Allies let it exist because it was useful for communicating orders to scattered German forces, for managing the massive logistical nightmare of processing millions of prisoners, for maintaining some semblance of order during the transition. But it was a fiction. Dönitz had no power. His orders were subject to Allied approval. His government occupied a few buildings in a small port city, surrounded by British troops. On May 23rd, British soldiers arrived at Dönitz's headquarters and arrested him. The government of the Third Reich, which had started with torchlight parades and speeches about a 1,000-year empire, ended with a 63-year-old admiral being led away in handcuffs while his staff watched in silence. Dönitz never expressed regret about Hitler. At Nuremberg, he defended his decision to continue fighting after Hitler's death, arguing he had saved hundreds of thousands of lives by facilitating evacuations westward. He was probably right about that. He also argued he had known nothing about the Holocaust, about the death camps, about the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. That was almost certainly a lie. But Dönitz maintained it until his death in 1980, 35 years after Hitler's suicide. The truth about Hitler's death, the full truth, emerged slowly in the weeks after the surrender. Soviet forces found the burned bodies in the Reich Chancellery Garden. They conducted autopsies, identified the remains through dental records, confirmed the suicide. But Stalin, paranoid and suspicious, ordered the findings kept secret. For months, Soviet propaganda hinted that Hitler might have escaped, might be hiding in the West, that the British or Americans might be sheltering him. It was nonsense, but it served Stalin's purposes to keep the uncertainty alive. German generals, learning the real story, had varied reactions. Some, like Keitel, refused to believe it. The Führer would never take the coward's way out, they insisted. He died fighting. Others, like Guderian, were unsurprised. Of course Hitler killed himself, Guderian would write in his memoirs. What else could he do? Face justice. Face the German people he had led to destruction. Suicide was the only option left. The younger officers, the ones who had fought the war's final battles, tended toward a darker view. Hitler's death changed nothing, they said. The war was lost weeks before he pulled the trigger. His suicide was just the final act of a man who had never cared about Germany, only about his own mythology. He could not bear to be captured, to be photographed in defeat, to stand trial. So he took the easy way out and left everyone else to face the consequences. In the decades after the war, historians would debate what the generals knew, when they knew it, how much they enabled. The answers varied by individual. Some, like Keitel, were true believers who followed Hitler into the abyss. Others, like Guderian, were professionals who served their country and told themselves that was different from serving the regime. Still others, like Schörner, were fanatics who exceeded even Hitler's brutality. And a very few, like Klaus von Stauffenberg, who tried to kill Hitler in July 1944, recognized the evil and tried to stop it. But in May 1945, in the immediate aftermath of Hitler's death, most of the generals were not thinking about history's judgment. They were thinking about survival, their own survival, the survival of their men, the survival of whatever could be salvaged from the wreckage. Dönitz negotiated surrender terms. Kesselring maintained order in Bavaria. Jodl signed the documents. They did what generals do. They managed the situation in front of them. The emotional reckoning would come later. In prison cells at Nuremberg, listening to testimony about the camps, in the long years after release, living in a divided Germany, watching their country rebuilt by the victors. In old age, writing memoirs, trying to explain how they had served a monster without becoming monsters themselves. Some of them succeeded in that explanation. Most did not. Because the uncomfortable truth, the truth that emerged in trial after trial, memoir after memoir, was that Hitler had not acted alone. He had needed generals to plan his wars, to lead his armies, to execute his orders. Some of those generals had been enthusiastic accomplices. Others had been reluctant enablers, but very few had been active resistors. When news of Hitler's death reached the front lines, the reactions of ordinary soldiers were often more honest than those of their commanders. Relief, exhaustion, a sense that the insanity could finally end. In the West, German soldiers surrendered in massive groups, whole divisions marching into captivity with barely a shot fired. In the East, where Soviet vengeance waited, the fighting continued longer, more desperately, men trying to reach Western lines before the surrender took effect. One soldier, a 22-year-old private named Klaus Becker, would later describe the moment he heard Hitler was dead. He was in a foxhole outside Bremen, surrounded by British forces, out of ammunition, waiting for permission to surrender. "We just started laughing," he said in an interview 40 years later. "Not happy laughing, crazy laughing. Like we had all been part of some terrible joke and the punchline had finally arrived. The Führer was dead, the war was over, and we were still alive. It did not feel real." For the generals, it felt very real. They had commanded armies, made decisions that killed millions, served a regime that would be remembered as one of history's greatest evils. Hitler's death did not absolve them of that. It just meant they had to answer for it without him. Keitel at Nuremberg would claim he was just following orders. The court would reject that defense and sentence him to hang. Jodl would make the same argument and receive the same sentence. Dönitz would get 10 years for his role in the U-boat campaign. Guderian would avoid trial, living until 1954, long enough to see Germany begin its recovery. Schörner would serve 6 years in Soviet captivity, then 4 more in German prison for the soldiers he had executed. None of them, in their final statements, would express regret for serving Hitler. They would regret the war's outcome, regret Germany's defeat, regret the suffering of the German people. But the man himself, the Führer they had followed into catastrophe, that they would defend or rationalize or simply refuse to discuss. Perhaps that was the final verdict on what German generals said when they heard Hitler was dead. They said what generals always say when their commander falls. They focused on the mission, on the practical questions, on what came next. The moral reckoning, the historical judgment, the question of their own guilt, those could wait. In May 1945, there was simply too much else to do. The war ended 8 days after Hitler died. The Third Reich, which had promised to last a millennium, survived its founder by just over a week. The generals who had built that Reich, who had led its armies, who had enabled its crimes, outlived it by decades. They wrote their memoirs, gave their interviews, told their stories. And in all those words, across all those years, very few of them ever truly confronted what they had done, or why, or what it meant that they had done it in the name of a man who ended his life with a bullet in a bunker, abandoning them to face the judgment